have this PowerPoint on the ontological argument, so I'm going to start off where pretty much where we left off. Going to review a slide or two. We were looking at Anselm's version, and we got up to the point where we were going to look at his fellow monk Guanillo's criticism of the ontological argument. But just to review a few slides, and by the way, this is now in Blackboard for you. I thought I had put it there already. I checked this morning and it was not, so my apologies, but it is there now. And so we saw that the ontological argument works with a concept of who God is, of God's being, God's existence. And the concept that Anselm works with of God is that God is the greatest being we can imagine or think of. God is that than which none greater can be thought, right? And so Anselm has showed us that, hey, it's greater for something to exist in reality than just as a concept in the mind. A painting that actually exists after being painted by a painter has more reality, is greater than just the concept of that painting in the mind of the painter before it was painted. So hence it's greater to exist in reality. But the point is, if the concept we're working with of God is that God is the greatest possible being, then in order to qualify as the greatest possible being, that being has to exist in reality and not just as a concept in the mind. This is what Anselm was trying to get us to see. So, God then has to exist in reality in order to qualify that. Otherwise, if the fool were right, the denier of God, to say, okay, I'll agree with you on the concept of God. Yeah, if there were a God around, God would be the greatest being we could think of. But I don't think that being exists. Well, Anselm would essentially reply, well, look, whatever or whoever you're thinking of, if you're denying existence to whatever you're thinking of, then whatever you're thinking of must not be the greatest being imaginable, because in order to be the greatest being imaginable, that being has to exist. Now, there's a little Platonism, actually there's a lot of Platonism buried in this that we're not going to go into in detail, but for Plato, something that exists is greater than something that doesn't exist. And so, if God is the greatest possible being, then God has to exist. So, let me, again, folks, I'm going to kind of stay over here because I'm using the mic in that, not the lapel mic. So anyway, so the fool then has to admit that whatever's in his or her mind, if it really is the greatest being imaginable, then that being has to also exist in reality. Or else, whatever you're thinking of, it's not the greatest being you can think of. Because the greatest being you can think of has to exist in reality as well. So how would you reply to an abstract argument like this? Well, Guanillo is a fellow monk I guess he's in the same monastery with Anselm. You know, again, folks, we've had people filtering in the last 5 minutes. It's wonderful to see all of your bright and shining and smiling faces, and I know this is a big campus, and it's sometimes hard to get between classes in the middle of the day. But again, it's very, you're not going to disturb me by walking in, but it's very distracting to your fellow classmates if you're walking in late when they're trying to pay attention to what's going on. Okay, so Guanillo is presumably as devout a believer in God as is Anselm. So you say, well, wait a second, but he's criticizing Anselm's argument. Well, yeah, let me make the point I made last time. It's one thing to believe or not to believe in God. It's quite another thing entirely to agree or disagree that somebody's argument, who they claim proves God, really does the job. And Guanillo is saying, okay, I believe in God, but I don't believe that your argument, your ontological argument that attempts to prove God really does the job. So how does he try to show this? He uses a technique that's a great debating technique, a great way to try to refute somebody's position on your feet. When we study this in logic, we teach students that it has the name refutation by logical analogy. Now, you know what an analogy is. If something is analogous to something else, it's like something else in certain respects, right? So you say, well, what's the difference between an analogy and a logical analogy? Well, basically, an argument that is like another argument in its logical structure is logically analogous to it. In other words, when we're talking logical analogy, we're saying, here's an argument that has the same structure as the original argument. Now, the reason we have a separate subject called logic is, remember what you did in algebra when you were talking about shoes and boxes or sticks or bundles of sticks, and they said, well, you can replace these things with variables and just talk about things in the abstract as A's, B's, and C's. Well, essentially, we have a separate subject called logic because we can replace with variables what arguments are about and just look at their structure. And so if an argument's structure is bad, that argument's structure is bad no matter what it's an argument about. And so this is an attempt by Guanillo to show that the basic structure of Anselm's ontological argument is bad, and it doesn't do the job. So what you try to show when you're refuting somebody by logical analogy is that their reasoning is wrong, and the way you try to do this is you construct a parallel argument, an argument that has the same structure, but that either proves something absurd or contradictory. And you say, well, if I can prove something absurd with the same kind of reasoning you're using, then there's something wrong with your reasoning. And that's Guanillo's approach to Anselm. He says, look, Anselm, okay, you're talking about God as the greatest being we can think of or imagine. Well, you know, the greatest X we can think of or imagine applies to other things. He says, what about the greatest island we can think of or imagine? And you and I, if somebody said, hey, imagine what's the greatest island you could think of? And we'd probably, picture some lush tropical paradise that we'd love to be at, rather than, on the third floor of Grace Jacobs today, right? And so Guanillo says, I think the very same reasoning that you're using to prove God in the ontological argument could also prove from the mere concept of the most perfect island that it exists. And we shouldn't be able to do that, Anselm. So, in other words, Guanillo says, well, we could reason in the same way you're reasoning about God and say, look, the most perfect island can't exist only in the mind, or we could think of a better one, a greater one, namely one that existed in reality as well. So the greatest island we can think of must exist in reality in order to qualify as that. Now, again, there's some Platonism built into this, where something that exists is greater than something that isn't, in Plato's thinking. But we're not going to go off onto that tangent. So, in other words, Guanillo is saying, I could prove that the most perfect island exists just from the concept of the most perfect island, not from any facts that I've observed from the world. And wouldn't this seem odd that from the mere concept of that island we could develop a proof that shows that it has to be out there somewhere? And so it seems odd, as I say in this slide, that we should be able to prove by mere thought alone, that is, from the concept of the most perfect island, that such an island must be out there somewhere, actually existing. And so, where do we go from here? Well, basically, Guanillo says, where we go from here is that it's better to question the reasoning that gives us this result that claims to prove the existence of the most perfect island just from the concept of it. But then he'd go on to say, but wait a second, Anselm, isn't that the same kind of reasoning you're using to prove God in the ontological argument? But this reasoning has also given us the ontological argument. So he says, there's something wrong with your reasoning. Anselm's reply has always been very unsatisfying to me. But he says, well, you know what? The case of God is somehow unique. And your analogy, Guanillo, doesn't work. That when we're talking about God as the unqualifiedly greatest being, that's different than talking about the greatness of a contingent created thing like the most perfect island. Still, I think the Platonism built into the argument makes his response a little questionable. But at any rate, Descartes revises this argument to try to incorporate that observation that that somehow existence is necessary to the very nature of God in a way that it's not absolutely necessary to the nature of the most perfect island. We will look at Descartes later on. Remember, some of those philosophers he saw in that video said that one of the things that motivated them to get into philosophy was reading Descartes when they were younger. And it might be the same with me. My English teacher in college, the one who taught as much philosophy as English, not in college, but at Baltimore Polytechnic, which if you're from out of town is a high school, Baltimore Polytechnic Institute, had us reading some philosophers, and Descartes was one of them. Descartes tried to give us absolutely solid foundations for knowledge, but he had an odd way of doing this. He used all kinds of skeptical arguments to doubt a lot of what he believed, and he said, what I'm trying to do is sift through and find something that I can't doubt, something that will function with the same certainty as the axioms do in geometry. If you remember your plane geometry, you might remember that the whole system was built on a few axioms that were considered to be self-evidently true. In other words, all you had to do is hear a statement like the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and you immediately perceived its truth. Well, so Descartes, in his quest along the way, doubts the existence of the material world. He says that's not absolutely sure and certain. Now he tries to get back his original beliefs by first trying to prove God's existence and that God is no deceiver if he's morally perfect. So at this point, to prove God, Descartes cannot use an a posteriori argument, an argument based on observations about the world like the design argument or the cosmological argument, the argument that says that the world needed a first cause because things cause one another in this world. Things don't just happen for no reason. In other words, he can't prove God using observations about the world because at this point he's questioning whether the world is provable itself. So he uses an abstract argument, and he uses more than one, but the main one he uses is an updated, a new improved version, if you will, of Descartes', not Descartes, but of Anselm's ontological argument. That's why I say it's the ontological argument restated. Frankly, if you had a little hard time understanding Anselm's version, I think Descartes' version is a little more straightforward and easier to get a handle on. And I know these are some very abstract arguments. Both Anselm's and Descartes' version make the same a priori logical move. Both claim that we can move from the concept of God to a claim that the being who fits that concept must necessarily exist. Now, we just saw that St. Anselm works with the concept of God as the greatest being we can think of or imagine. God is that than which none greater can be thought. What concept of God does Descartes work with? Well, he works with a concept of God that's much more in line with what you find in theology books, with a concept of God that lists God's basic attributes or qualities. So Descartes works with a concept of God as God being the supremely perfect being, as the being who has all perfections, all perfect qualities. Now, here's what Descartes is trying to claim. Basically, that existence is an essential part of who God is, of God's essence, in a way that it is not an essential part of the essence of the most perfect island. And he draws a parallel with geometry. Now, if any of you took analytic geometry in high school, you know, a kind of mixture of algebra and geometry with tangents, cosines, and all and the like, you might remember that everything is done on an XY axis, and coordinates on an XY axis, even today, we call Cartesian coordinates after Descartes. Descartes is no slouch in geometry. As a matter of fact, he either invented or discovered, whichever way you want to talk about it, analytic geometry. If you took analytic geometry in high school, as I did at Poly, you have Descartes to thank for it. Right? And so, even today, we call coordinates on an XY axis Cartesian coordinates. Because it rolls off the English palate better than Descartesian coordinates. So, Descartes wants to convince us that existence is such an essential property of who God is that it's like the essential properties of having three sides and three angles are to a triangle. So he says existence cannot be separated from the essence of God any more than having three angles equal to two right angles can be separated from the essence of a triangle. Now look at this diagram. Right? It's not essential. Things have essential characteristics, right? Things that have to do with that thing being essentially what it is, right? Now, it's not essential to a triangle that it be either red or yellow or black, like the triangles you see pictured in this graphic, right? It's not essential to a triangle that it be any particular color. But it is essential to a triangle being a triangle that it have three sides and three angles that add up to 180 degrees, right? So what Descartes is going to try to convince us of is that the property of existence is for God like having three sides and three angles is for a triangle. It's absolutely essential to God's nature and cannot be separated from God. So how does he move? So we can't, well, before I get to that, he says we can't even think of God except as existing, just as we can't even think of a triangle without thinking of it as having three angles and three sides, right? So why is God's existence not separable from God's essential nature, from God's essence? Well, Descartes' answer is goes back to this concept of God being the supremely perfect being. Again, this is traditional monotheism, right? Descartes is a Roman Catholic Christian. Now, we're going to see that Immanuel Kant is a Christian in the German Lutheran tradition. Kant believed in God, but doesn't accept Descartes' version of the ontological argument. Well, let's talk about this concept of God as the supremely perfect being. That means that if there's a perfect quality and God is the most perfect being, God must have that perfect quality. So suppose we tried to list God's attributes or qualities. Now, we could list the traditional attributes of God this way, right? We can say God is all-powerful. I'm going to move back over here just because that's where the mic is. God possesses omnipotence. We say God is all-knowing. God is omniscient, possesses the quality of omniscience. God is omnipresent. God is everywhere. It's not that God gets around the universe so fast, but that the universe is, in a sense, in God, rather than the other way around. And God is omnibenevolent, merciful, and morally perfect. Now, for Descartes, the left description fails as a description of the supremely perfect being because it leaves out a very important quality. And what quality does it leave out? Well, it leaves out of the list existence. And so I've put it in the list to the right. Now, this is the way I've portrayed it for years. A new text I use finally gets around to listing it this way. So what is the upshot of treating God this way? Well, it's to say that God exists so completely that God can't even be thought of as not existing. And so the fool would contradict himself to agree that if God exists, God is the supremely perfect being, but then to go on to deny that God lacks existence. In other words, if we back it up here, putting existence in the list of God's qualities as part of the concept of God as a supremely perfect being means that you can't say, well, you know what, I don't believe in God, but if God were around, yeah, I'd agree with you, Descartes, God would be the supremely perfect being. But God doesn't exist. Well, Descartes would reply, well, wait a second, you're contradicting yourself, because in buying into the concept of God as a supremely perfect being, you've just bought into God's existence, right? Because existence is one of God's perfect qualities, one of God's perfections, a quality he has by virtue of being the supremely perfect being. So it's building existence into the description of who God is that makes it a contradiction for somebody who denies God's existence to do so, right? So you can summarize this argument by saying God has all perfections, all perfect qualities. Existence is a perfection, therefore God has existence, or God exists. So how does Kant respond? Now this is an abstract logical point, but I think most people can, when it's explained to them, kind of get what Kant is saying here. In English, we talk about predicates, right? A predicate that applies to something. We use the word predication in logic as well to describe what we do when we say something has a particular quality. Like if we talked about I don't know if that's a purse or a book bag, but it's Raven's purple, right? We said that's purple. We're predicating being purple of that book bag or purse, right? If we say this cup is styrofoam, we're predicating being composed of styrofoam of this cup, right? if I say the coffee is cold, which it is, I'm predicating being cold of the coffee in this cup. Okay? So when we say something has a quality, that's called predication in logic. So how does that apply here? Well, note we're predicating qualities of God in the list of God's description. So when we describe a thing, we're said to predicate various qualities of that thing, right? And we refer to these qualities as logical predicates, as the properties a thing has. Now, Descartes' version of the ontological argument famously has existence functioning as just another one of God's qualities as a logical predicate. And what Descartes does is say, no, existence does not function that way. It's not just another property of a thing that it exists. And you don't add anything to the description of a thing by saying it exists. I mean, my car right now is parked out behind my house in a parking pad that used to be where our garage was when I was growing up. If I describe it, and it's getting up there, and I say, well, okay, it's a Chevy Aveo, it's blue, it has 4 cylinders, it exists, it has an automatic transmission, it has a trunk and 4 doors. You say, well, wait a second, Prof. Morosky, back up in a second. You say it's blue and it has a 4-cylinder engine and it exists and it has an automatic transmission. Existence isn't just another property like being blue and having 4 doors, right? What Kant points out is that existence isn't a property of a thing, but something has to exist in order for it to have any properties at all, right? In other words, the sports car, which most definitely is not my car, unfortunately, has to exist in order to have any properties at all. So a car has to exist in order to have qualities, but existence is not just another quality in this description, along with being red or having, in this case, 2 doors. So how does this apply? Well, Kant says, look, existence logically does not function as just another list of a thing's qualities. First, we can describe something we're talking about with all of its qualities. In other words, I could describe my car with all the qualities I could think of, but then it's another step to say it exists in the parking lot here rather than behind my house, right? So we describe a thing with all of its qualities and then afterwards talk about whether it exists or not. Now, you can say, well, why is this a criticism of Descartes' version of the ontological argument? Well, it was building existence into God's description that made it a contradiction to buy into the description and then deny God's existence. But if we take existence out of God's description, out of the list of God's qualities, then we can describe God and either agree that God exists or say that God doesn't exist without falling into contradictions. And remember, now Kant, again, believes in God, but he thinks we can deny God's existence without contradicting ourselves in the way that the ontological argument forces us to do. So when we deny existence to something, Kant says we don't fall into contradictions because we reject the thing with all of its qualities. In other words, if I say there is no red sports car pictured on this slide, I've rejected the red sports car with all of its qualities. Now, go back to the triangle. Kant says, yeah, if something is a triangle, it's correct. Descartes, you're correct to say that we can't think of a triangle without thinking of it as having three sides and three angles. Yeah, we've got to do that. But if we deny the existence of any triangle, we reject it with all of its properties, with all of its sides and all of its angles. And there's no contradiction to say, you know what, there's no triangle in this slide, because I've rejected it with all of its properties. And likewise, Kant says we can describe God with all of God's qualities and only afterwards talk about whether the being that has those qualities exists or does not exist, and no contradiction arises in doing so. Now, there was a version of this argument trotted out in a very technical way by two famous philosophers, Norman Malcolm and Alvin Plantinga, who's now at Notre Dame, but it was at Calvin College then, that basically was a version of the ontological argument that got around Kant's criticisms, because it treats existence as modern logic treats existence, and that is not as a predicate like Descartes did, but in exactly the way Immanuel Kant treated existence. So there are more recent versions of the ontological argument that have gotten around Kant's criticisms and that totally reopened the debate, like in the 1960s, and I guess it was as early as the 50s. When these came out, they reopened the debate about whether the argument may work after all. I'm not going to get into them, but at any rate, the discussion about this particular proof of God still continues.